Welcome to the next video in the Understanding Security series. So the usual disclaimer, as with all of the videos in this series, this is not something made specifically for YouTube. This is a recording of a lecture that I gave to a live audience recently. So again, the quality is maybe not perfect, but hopefully it will be adequate, and hopefully someone out there will find this useful. So this week we're on to water security. Which links quite closely, of course, to next week's topic, which is food security. But also, it's another kind of, again, we're not kind of studying environmental security as a topic in its own right. We kind of touched on environmental security last week when we talked about energy. Again, water is kind of another dimension of that. The impact of climate change, the impact of changing rainfall patterns is directly relevant for understanding of water security. So if kind of energy is the cause, water is kind of the consequence. Again, how do we define water security? Well, one way is to define it as the capacity of a population to ensure that they have, or they continue to have, access to potable water. And what do we mean by potable? Effectively, we mean drinkable. But of course, water is needed for more things than just drinking. I mean, that's the most obvious thing. Water is kind of more immediately urgent than anything else apart from oxygen. In that you can survive several weeks without food. You can't survive more than a few days at most without water, and potentially less than that in a hot climate. But of course, it's not just about drinking. It's also about the use of water for sanitation, which again is directly related, of course, to human health. Without adequate sanitation, you end up with cholera and all kinds of other diseases, which, I mean, in the UK was kind of a big issue up until kind of the middle of the 19th century and remains so in much of the world. The use of water in agriculture, of course. You can't grow crops without adequate irrigation. Use by industry, including, not limited to, energy. So all of these could be looked at, as we'll see later on, through an interstate or an intrastate security lens. There's also, of course, the potential for an excess of water in the sense of having floods, which again is an issue that the UK is facing increasingly in recent years. So again, think about the interdependencies between water and other types of security, energy production, food security in particular, agriculture, irrigation and so on. Also the use of water in industry, particularly in energy production. Now the thing is, you might think, well, we've got plenty of water. We live on a planet which is, has more water than land, which is true. But of course, seawater without heavy treatment is not drinkable or necessarily usable by industry either. The salt content, of course, is pretty corrosive. So fresh water is what we need. And yes, seawater can be converted to fresh water, of course, by desalination, but that's energy, can be quite energy intensive, can be quite expensive. It's not a viable solution for more than a fraction of the water that humanity uses. So we're talking about fresh water. And the thing is, we're already using much of the fresh water that is available. Of available renewable freshwater resources, more than half has already been appropriated by humanity for various uses, chief among which is irrigation, also industry. Domestic use is a relatively small fraction in actual fact, and water usage is increasing. as population increases in both the developing and developed world. And this is kind of part of the problem, and this impacts on the water. So many of the issues that we talk about, the great cause of the environmental crisis. Human population is exploding, seriously exploding. You know, for most of human history, world population has been much less than 1 billion people. You know, if you go back 1,000 years or so, we're talking less than, you know, 500 million. About 1/3 of a billion people worldwide. Today, I mean, that only goes up to 2,000. You know, the graph has continued to go up. We're now north of 8 billion. You know, so, I mean, it's difficult to be sure, of course, because in many parts of the world, you know, populations are only estimates, but we're talking well north of 8 billion and continuing to rise. You know, some estimates say we could be reaching 12 billion worldwide by the end of the century, and that's a problem, you know, because we have a finite planet, we have finite resources, and we cannot support, you know, an infinite sort of growth in human population. At some point, we're going to hit a point where the planet can't sustain any more people. We can debate, you know, when that point will be reached and exactly how many people we can support as a planet, but you know, rising population is, you know, is an issue, a big issue. So yeah, you know, water usage kind of illustrates that point. And of course, the other sort of big problem is climate change and changing the rainfall patterns that is bringing about. And particularly, you know, we're talking, you know, much of Europe is going to be affected by this. Less so the UK, but much of particularly southern Europe is going to be affected, but also much of Africa, much of Central and Southern Africa, large parts of South America, parts of Asia as well, and parts of North America. Are going to be affected by changing rainfall patterns, and of course the impact that is going to have, particularly on agriculture. Again, it's not just about not having enough water to drink or, you know, for sanitation, although that's important, but, you know, when we consider that 70% of water is used for agriculture, you know, that water supply disappears, then you can't grow stuff. You can't, you know, can't grow stuff, then the land becomes uninhabitable, effectively. And of course, that's going to result in mass population movements because it can't result in anything else. People, you know, can no longer make a living from the land. If you know, if they're no longer able to farm where they are, then they're going to have to go somewhere else. They can't do anything else, and of course, that is going to cause mass migration and the issues that comes along with that. So yeah, obviously water is a renewable resource. I mean, I'm sure we've all kind of, as kids in school, we all studied the water cycle, so it is a renewable resource in that sense, but we don't have an unlimited supply of it, and rates of use and replenishment may not balance. It's not something that tends to be traded as a global commodity. You know, small amount is bottled, small amount of bottled water is kind of traded, but you know, it's not a significant amount. Again, as we've said, distribution is extremely uneven. Some parts of the world have plenty of it, other parts of the world don't. And we'll kind of come back to global governance, to kind of international regimes and rules around water and its usage. But there is a global regime, but how effective it is another question. And again, think about the kind of impacts on development as well. So again, water essential for industry, for agriculture. So think about how that kind of intersects with development as well. So again, looking at it through a security lens, obviously we can look at it through a human security lens. That's probably the most obvious thing. We can look at it through an environmental security lens, but also an economic security lens and a political and national security lens as well. Again, environmental security as kind of again, this widening of the definition of security, way beyond the kind of military sort of the traditional definition of very narrow sort of definition of security as military security. But again, can certainly be linked to the idea of national security. Sanitation, of course, is a big aspect of water security, because again, ultimately, without adequate sanitation, then the result is disease. And again, this is not just some hypothetical thing. This is a daily reality for the world's population. So the UN Development Programme estimate that approximately 2 million children, and again, this is children, so not adults, die each year as a result of a lack of clean water and adequate sanitation. That's 5 million starving to death and 2 million dying because of a lack of water and sanitation. That really kind of puts, starkly highlights the real sort of inequalities at the global level and the human consequences of that. In 2015, okay, this is 10 years ago, but I don't think things have changed, certainly not as much as they need to change. 2.7 billion people without access to basic sanitation, that's a World Health Organization estimate. The lowest coverage being Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia and Oceania, which again, we're talking a third to a half of people in those areas not having basic sanitation, not having flush toilets and so on. So obviously this leads to things like cholera, dysentery, typhoid, hepatitis A. Estimated that in Africa 115 people die every hour through diseases linked to contaminated water. Diarrhea, again, we think of in the Western world, we think of diarrhea as just kind of a bit of an inconvenience, but it's deadly, in parts of the world, deadly illness. Responsible for 1.5 million deaths per year, mostly very young children. So, how to deal with the issue? I mean, again, so it's partly a technical issue, hydrology, the kind of science and technology and industry of water management. So again, a lot of this is about management of river basins. The rivers are kind of the main drainage channels, if you like, and the main source of much of human water, but also it's about groundwater as well, of course. Because again, groundwater really is the source of everything else. I mean, where the rivers come from, they come from, largely they come from springs, which form streams, which combine to form rivers. And of course, groundwater also accessed directly through wells and so on. And again, contamination of that groundwater is a big issue, by industry, by chemicals and so on, but also by sewage. One of the big pollution issues is if your water source is also the same place that your sewage is going, then you've got a problem. And again, they may not be kind of one and the same, but if they're close enough together, it kind of seeps through the ground. You've kind of got a well here, and your toilets here. Contamination happens. So, lots of different indicators of quality of water, and again, what do we call good quality water? It depends what measures that you're using. But also kind of, increasing numbers of chemical contaminants as well. And that includes, obviously, things like pesticides and so on. It's a big problem, including in the West. The amount of pesticide, which is in the domestic water supply, is frightening, even here, even in the West. But also things like pharmaceuticals, ending up in the water supply. Microplastics, of course, is becoming an issue which is increasingly recognised. Plastic not degrading fully, kind of breaking down to microparticles. And we're all walking around, we're all full of plastic, all of us, and what the long-term effects on that, on human health, we don't really know. There's not enough data over a long enough period of time to really say. There are also lots of kind of social, ethical, cultural dimensions around this. If we think of gender and water, in many parts of the world, women kind of bear a disproportionate share of water collection. It's kind of seen as the job of women, and to some extent children, to kind of go and collect water from whatever water source is available, if there's kind of no plumbing available. The cultural significance of water, of course, water, the idea of water as kind of a spiritual thing is a significant part of many cultural traditions, many religions, including, of course, Christianity. Think of kind of baptism, that's kind of one example of the cultural significance of water, but many other cultures have similar, traditions, and bodies of water being seen as kind of sacred places in some cultures. So yeah, the idea of water as a human right. Do we see access to water as a human right? Well, certainly some definitions of human rights would include that. And then I think, again, it's kind of, I guess, second generation human rights. First generation human rights were kind of civil and political rights. Second generation were kind of about rights to things like things like access to water and also economic security and so on. So yeah, water is a human right, and again, if it's a right, then who is responsible for ensuring that that right is fulfilled? So again, we can look at it at the intrastate level, we can look at it at the interstate level. Intrastate, obviously, we tend to look to the state to do things like ensuring an adequate water supply. But again, that depends on the state. So we can kind of come back to the idea of weak states, states which are under-resourced, states which don't really function very well, whose job is it to step in if the state is not able to fulfil, basic needs of its people in terms of water supply. And again, if we think of water as a human right, then it's got to be someone's job to ensure that that right is fulfilled. So if the state can't do it, to what extent is it up to the international community to do it? Role of NGOs, of course, things like Water Aid and so on. There are lots of charities which kind of, lots of NGOs which operate in this area, but to what extent is it the job of the international interstate community to provide water aid? But assuming that the state is able to kind of manage it effectively, what does the state, what are kind of the dimensions that need to be considered? So again, balancing human consumption with the needs of agriculture, the needs of industry, and so on. Thinking about the rights of different groups, and again, minority groups possibly disadvantaged in terms of access to water. So quantity is obviously an issue, but also quality, of course. The use of water by industry and agriculture is important for development. What's the knock-on effect of that in terms of pollution, in terms of fertiliser or pesticides or industrial byproducts into the water supply? So again, these things have to be balanced. On the one hand, the needs of agriculture and industry and development, but on the other hand, the quality of the human water supply. And again, this is not just limited to the developing world. We have these same issues in the West as well. As we know, particularly in this country, the quality of our water supply has arguably got a lot worse in recent decades. The amount of contamination of our sort of rivers and bodies of fresh water by sewage, and by agricultural sort of byproducts and so on. It's a huge issue even in the UK and getting worse. You can also think about, an excess of water as well, floods and so on as kind of a, as kind of a natural disaster event. Think about the knock-on effects. Both of kind of floods, but also lack of water. The knock-on effects on civil society, i.e., law and order, competition for scarce resources, and so on. So again, this obviously impacts on other types of security as well. How does the state go about managing water, particularly, if supplies are limited and there's a need to ration it? Well, obviously, it depends on whether we're going for a kind of state sector model or a private sector model. Do we leave it to the market? Does the state regulate? How much profit is it kind of legitimate for water companies to make out of water is a human right? Is it legitimate to make vast profits out of charging people to access it? But on the other hand, the money is needed for investment as well, in terms of investment in upgrading and maintaining the water supply. So yeah, charges, taxation, metering, and so on. Obviously, it's going to depend. It's going to vary from state to state exactly how that is implemented. How does the government increase supply? Again, there are things like obvious things like building reservoirs, building dams, and so on. And again, this may be for purposes other than just water supply for drinking. It may be for energy generation, hydroelectrics, and so on. Think about the need for flood management, flood barriers. How do you go about managing floods? Flood barriers, drainage canals, and so on. Desalination is one option for coastal states. Again, that is expensive and energy intensive. What kind of crops can you grow? Again, another strategy might be to kind of grow stuff which requires less water. Technological innovations, so again, things like smart irrigation systems that don't waste water. Leak detection. Again, this is a big issue in the UK. The water companies tell us not to use our hose pipes, but then they'll lose billions of gallons through leaking pipes every day, which is quite frustrating, and again, whose job is it to fix that? Water reuse technologies. So again, once water has been used for one purpose, it may no longer be any use for, sort of human sort of domestic use, but it might be perfectly fine for industry or even for irrigation, for example. So can you use the same water multiple times? So again, think about wastewater treatment approaches and so on, and how water can be, recycled. So, the state obviously is part of the solution within its own territory, but also at the interstate level. Think about the ways in which water can, potentially be something that states can work together on, but it can also be a source of conflict as well. And Boutros Ghali, who was the former UN Secretary General, who was originated in Egypt, argued that the next war in that region would be over water, specifically the waters of the Nile. And I'll come back to that one in a moment, kind of the Nile conflict. But again, the basic issue is, if rivers flow through multiple states, then there's the potential for conflict. So if you get one state, which is kind of upstream of the next state, and they decide to build a dam, or they decide to divert a lot of the water from that river for agriculture or industry or whatever, that may mean that the state downstream suddenly is not, getting their share of it. And there is a potential for that to lead to, out warfare. And there are lots of kind of current disputes like that. So the Euphrates and Tigris rivers among Turkey and Syria and Iraq. The Jordan River, of course, which flows through Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine. The Nile, I mentioned, which I'll be coming back to. Central Asia, around the Aral Sea. Again, lots of potential for interstate conflicts to arise over water, and who's getting the fair share. Is one state hogging it? Is one state polluting it more than the others? So again, potential for a cause cause of conflict. But, so we could take a realist perspective on this, and we could see it in national security terms. But we could also look at the potential for cooperation as well, and look at this to a liberal lens. I'll come on to the Nile conflict. Again, the Nile, as you probably know, is the longest river in the world. It flows through 11 different countries. And, particularly downstream, and again, you'll know if you've kind of done any sort of ancient history, and you looked at ancient Egypt, for example, the dependence of Egypt on the waters of the Nile, which has been the case for 5,000 years, or more. But of course, Egypt is kind of the last country that the Nile flows through. There are various other countries before it gets to Egypt. And in particular, Ethiopia, in recent years, has been building a dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And the main purpose of this is to generate hydroelectric power. So again, remember that Ethiopia is a pretty poor country, one of the poorer countries in Africa, kind of in desperate need of energy for development. So again, linking in with last week's topic. So Ethiopia had this idea of building the Gerd Dam on the Blue Nile, which is one of the two rivers which come together to form the Nile. But Egypt is worried that the dam will reduce water flow downstream, and that will have a massive impact, of course, on Egypt and on Egyptian agriculture and water security. Sudan also, which of course is downstream of Ethiopia, also had a problem with this initially, but they were kind of bought off by Ethiopia, promising them a share of the electricity supply, a share of the cheap electricity. So Sudan kind of was won over to Ethiopia's side. Again, there's kind of been ongoing negotiations mediated by, the African Union and others, but no deal has yet been reached. And again, it's been said that there's real potential for, ultimately, for Egypt to get military action over it. That's not really ruled out. So again, that's kind of looking through the realist lens, but of course we can also, apply a liberal lens to this and say what is the scope for multilateral cooperation, multilateral regimes on water. And again, this involves lots of different agencies. So again, because of the nature of water, it kind of crosses over with the remit of various different UN agencies and programmes. So including, obvious ones, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, the UN Development Programme, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, of course, and outside of the interstate system, again, also many NGOs with a stake in this as well. So we mentioned WaterAid, Greenpeace is another obvious one. There are certain legal frameworks around the usage of water, and again, these kind of link together. So the first kind of set of rules, which were kind of guidelines rather than legally binding rules, were the Helsinki Rules, which were set out in 1966. So again, this is not a UN treaty, it's not a binding international treaty, but it's a set of guidelines which have been heavily influential on the treaties which came after. And they set kind of, a basic set of principles. So the idea of equitable and reasonable utilisation, the idea that, every country sharing an international river has the right to a fair and reasonable use of its waters, as well as an obligation not to cause harm, and also to cooperate in good faith with the other states involving kind of the river system, and to take kind of reasonable measures to prevent water pollution, and ultimately also providing a mechanism for peaceful settlement of disputes through arbitration and mediation and so on. So again, the Helsinki Rules not binding, but they heavily influence the 92 Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes. So this originated in Europe, but later became a worldwide convention, and again, similar kind of principles to the Helsinki Rules, but for the first time binding on signatories. Of course, not every state is a signatory, but to the states that have signed and ratified this, they commit themselves for the first time in binding legal terms to do things like, a commitment to equitable and reasonable utilisation. Who decides what is equitable and reasonable? That's quite vague. But to cooperate in joint management in various ways, joint management of the resource. And then we have the UN Watercourses Convention in 97, which kind of built on the 92 treaty, again built on similar principles: equitable, reasonable use, obligation not to cause significant harm, duty to cooperate, notification to each other of planned measures, protection of ecosystems. So again, in theory there is an international regime around this, and one which is legally binding on signatories, but it's also written and framed in quite vague terms, and there's lots of room for dispute around that. Mention the Millennium Development Goals, which you may have heard of, although they kind of expired 10 years ago. But the Millennium Development Goals were a set of goals set out by the UN in 2000 to achieve, various targets related to human development by 2015. And one of those targets was to halve by 2015 the proportion of the global population without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. Was that achieved? Well, again, it depends which metric you actually use, but by 2015, 91% of the global population had access to what is termed as an improved drinking water source. However, again, the devil is in the detail, and improved doesn't necessarily always mean safe. So, while on paper the Millennium Development Goal target was arguably achieved, the actual safety and quality of water, in many cases is not, not up to scratch. We then have the Sustainable Development Goals. So these were basically a follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals. So these were set in 2015 when the Millennium Development Goals expired. And once again, they were set over a 15-year time period. So the aim is to achieve these goals by 2030. So obviously we've got 5 years left to go. And again, you know, some of these, particularly in Section 6 and Section 14, are directly relevant to water security. Section 6 dealing with fresh water and human kind of usage of water. Section 14 mostly concerned with the oceans. So are we on target to achieve them? Well, again, the proportion of the global population with access to what is deemed to be safely managed drinking water did increase from about 68% in 2015 to about 74% as of 2024. So on the one hand, that's, you know, it's a modest increase. In terms of the number of people it affects, it's not insignificant, but we're still talking more than a quarter of the world's population don't have access to safe water, you know. So we're still talking 2 billion people or thereabouts and don't have access to safe water. So yeah, 2.2 billion as of 2024 approximately, and 3.4 billion lacking access to safely managed sanitation, 1.7 billion lacking basic hygiene services. So, you know, again, arguably these targets are not, you know, not really on track. Yes, there has been some improvement, modest improvement, but, you know, there's still a long way to go. In terms of future threats, of course, we've already mentioned some of these. We've mentioned climate change as a key threat. We've also mentioned population growth as a key threat. And, you know, migration, which again is going to result from climate change and population growth. So again, people move from one area because they can't stay there, so they move to another area. But then, of course, that increases pressure on resources in that area because you've suddenly got a huge increase in population in another area, which puts pressure on the resources there. So all of this is adding up to increased demand, you know, both globally, both regionally and locally as well. You know, urbanisation, again, what we think of as development, you know, doesn't come free. It comes with increased demand on water. In traditional communities, tend to use a lot less water than people living in cities. So as we see urbanisation, industrialisation, everything, we see more and more demand for water. So again, you know, depletion of resources. So we've got time, I think, to just look at a couple of case studies briefly of water crises and how these were successfully managed. So the first one is Cape Town in South Africa, which in 2018 faced the prospect of becoming the first major city in the world to effectively run out of water. This followed 3 consecutive years of severe drought, one of the worst in over a century, possibly climate change. So the city's reservoirs dropped below 15% capacity, and there was talk of what's termed day zero, i.e. the day that the city would run out of water altogether. You can imagine the consequences of that in a city of this size. So again, the causes were, you know, partly linked to climate change, but also an over-reliance on, you know, limited number of surface reservoirs, six dams, which again, you know, as the city had grown, the population of the city had grown, became less and less adequate. Rapid urbanisation, more and more people moving to the city, population growth, obviously increasing demand. And ultimately, we can look at this as a failure of governance because no one had done anything about it until it became a crisis. You know, there's not sufficient planning in advance. So the response of the government was to strictly ration water, limited to 50 litres per person per day in total. Now that sounds like a lot, but you're not going to drink 50 litres a day, obviously. But when you take into account, the amount that you use for washing, for flushing the toilet, all of the other use as well, which is kind of, it's not just what you use personally, it's kind of your impact in terms of, other services and so on, as well, which use water. So actually 50 litres per person per day is not a lot. Public communication campaign, so again, encouraging people to save water, making people aware of the nature of the crisis, but also, emergency measures to try to diversify supply in a hurry. So development of new aquifers, i.e. new managed water sources, Table Mountain and elsewhere. Increased emphasis on recycling and reuse of wastewater, so again industry using wastewater from domestic usage and so on, and also the setting up of desalination plants as well, which were on a relatively small scale but did help. So yeah, behavioural change, efforts to kind of create new supplies, rationing and so on. Did it work? Yes, it did. Day zero was successfully avoided. And again, in large part due to the cooperation of the public. So a successful, public communication campaign. Also, rainfall did recover, and the reservoirs did start to fill up a bit as well. But the crisis period was successfully avoided. By reducing water demand by more than 50%. So it shows what can be done if the public are on side, just in terms of behaviour change. But again, it illustrates the vulnerability of, even of developed urban centres to drought. I mean, again, we live in towns, we live in cities, we think we're invulnerable to this stuff, but we're not. We live on an eggshell in a sense, So yeah, demonstrating the importance of engagement. If you don't have the public on your side, then you're not going to successfully manage water supplies. But also what can be done by a combination of public goodwill and, an effective government campaign. Second case study is Singapore. So again, in some respects a similar case, although it was not so much about a single moment of crisis brought about by a single drought, but rather kind of slightly longer term issue of ensuring a sustainable water supply for 6 million people and a major industrial economy in a city-state which actually has limited supplies of fresh water. It has no natural freshwater lakes or aquifers, historically depended on imported water from Malaysia, and of course from a national security issue, being dependent on imports, particularly of something that you can't do without, is a problem. So Singapore developed a strategy which was known as the 4 National Tap Strategy. So first of all, a system of developing new reservoirs, 17 reservoirs, as well as an urban drainage network that channels rainwater into storage. So basically capturing, collecting and storing as much water as possible. Again, still dependence on, some imported water from Malaysia. Long-term agreements put in place to try to secure that supply, but at the same time trying to reduce that dependence. The use of technology through the new water strategy, use of technology to recycle water through things like microfiltration, reverse osmosis, ultraviolet light to kill bacteria and so on, and also the use of desalination plants as well, which ultimately supplied about 30% of demand. Again, all of this managed through a public utilities board set up under a single integrated authority, and the use of pricing controls make water expensive so that people use less of it. And that can be controversial, and depending on the area of the world where you do that, it's controversial. But it's one way of reducing demand. Of course, as in South Africa, also the use of education and public relations campaign to get the public to use less water. So yeah, this has been successful in that Singapore has, managed to secure adequate supply, and by 2060, aiming to meet 85% of its water needs through new water program and desalination. So again, reducing dependence on imported water. So again, Singapore is arguably a good example, a good model of integrated water resource management and technological innovation, which demonstrates what can be done with the combination of the application of technology, pricing mechanisms, public relations campaign, and so on. So, to summarise, we can define water security as the capacity of a population to ensure sustainable access to safe, sufficient and affordable water for livelihoods, well-being and development. So again, this encompasses quantity and quality dimensions. You need enough of it, but you also need it to be the right quality. And again, security dimensions, as we've seen, we can look at it through lots of different lenses, through national security lenses, through human security lenses, environmental security lenses. They overlap with other areas of security, like energy security, like economic security, food security. This is an issue which intersects with many others. So we can summarise the key components of water security as being access, excess, governance, and quality. So access, of course, is ensuring that not just individuals but also agriculture and industry and so on have sufficient supplies of water, at the same time being able to manage an excess of water, floods and so on. Good governance is vital for this, and ultimately the things that are trying to be achieved is not only a sufficient supply of water, but also dealing with the quality of water through pollution control and so on. The major threats, as we've seen, climate change, population growth, rising pollution, and all of these things are interlinked. There is the potential for conflict or cooperation over water in what we call transboundary basins, in areas where rivers or sometimes freshwater lakes shared between multiple countries. This is a potential source of conflict, but also the potential for a liberal solution, for a multilateral cooperative solution. There are global frameworks in place, as we've seen with the Helsinki guidelines leading on to the duties on water management. Think about, again, the role of NGOs as well, and the implications of water management for the Sustainable Development Goals. So I guess the key takeaways are that water security links environmental, economic, social and political systems. It requires integrated management, technological innovation, equitable governance, and also public cooperation, as we've seen, is a big sort of element of this. Resilience and cooperation required for a water secure future. Okay, so as usual, if you've got questions, save those for the seminar. Does everyone sign the register?
Oh, no, we haven't.